I remember frequently being criticised as being all things to all people, so it's refreshing to find somebody actually disagreeing substantially with what I've said. And I'm not at all surprised. I'm not at all surprised that unionists were unhappy about what I said. But what I was trying to do was point out what I perceive to be the reality of a trajectory which is continuing and will continue. Arlene quite rightly identified a series of things which were, to put it at the lowest level, upsetting to unionists, things that had happened which were offensive in some cases and deeply disturbing. But we also have to remember that in terms of the way people who are not from the unionist tradition, and not just nationalists, look at things, they say, well, wait a minute, the DUP walked out of the talks that led to the Belfast Agreement. They never supported the Belfast Agreement. And of course, they did support Brexit, which was deeply offensive to many Northern Ireland people who wanted to remain part of the United Kingdom. So the truth is that each side has found itself doing things that have disturbed, and Chairman, you mentioned
on a par with murdering somebody, John.
I didn't mention anything about anybody murdering anybody. And
well, people, I did. That was the point.
You did, but people from both sides got murdered in this. And the Chairman talked about the question.
Maybe how you conduct yourself in the House of Lords, but we're far more polite here.
Really?
Yes.
The question of trust, Mr. Chair, you mentioned. Trust is not a prerequisite for negotiations. It's an outcome of agreements reached and implemented and delivered on. And one of the major problems in Northern Ireland is that, to some degree, both of the major parties took the view that if they sufficiently disagreed with what was happening politically, they could bring the Assembly down, rather than finding other ways to make protest about things that they didn't agree with, but keep the Assembly operational. And it seems to me that that's the fundamental problem, that unless you say that the structures are sacrosanct and we will make our protests within the structures,
yes,
then you destroy the structures, and it's like two juggernauts driving down a narrow road towards each other, and each of the drivers throws the steering wheel out the window and says, now who's going to get it sorted out? And we've got to hold on to responsibility as colleagues, but that means that the Assembly has to be running, and Strand 2 has to be operational, and Strand 3 has to be operational as well. So I think we need to be a little careful that the world will continue on it. And the Windsor frameworks, we talk here as though the Windsor frameworks were about sorting out the Northern Ireland problem. They weren't. The purpose of the Windsor frameworks was so that the Prime Minister could reset relations with Europe and the United States. That was the real purpose of it. And he was extremely successful in doing that. The question of what then happens to Northern Ireland, that's another question. And whether I don't think that you're going to get fundamental changes in the Windsor frameworks. That's now been bedded in with the European Union, and I don't think that's going to change. And I rather subscribe to the view that Mark represented earlier on, that you may get some kind of decoration in terms of bits of legislation, but then people will have to be prepared to go back into an assembly and maintain that, come what may, or we'll be back into the same problem. And politics will then move on, including the constitutional question, in my view.
John, what you fail to do, with great respect to you, is acknowledge the important role that unionism has and the parties that represent them have when it comes to their mandate and the importance of having any agreement and going forward with unionism not on board. That's the unfortunate thing from a unionist point of view that we see. I say that with great respect to you, but honestly, you fail to understand that.
I understand it very well, Jim. I understand it very well. In fact, I remember my grandmother saying, it's great John's gone into politics, it's a pity he didn't go into it in the Unionist Party. But the problem is this, unionism no longer has the majority. It is no longer a dominant majority. And that's the thing that has changed.
John, we have great differences in that there. You'll have your opinion in relation to it, and we'll have a different opinion, and we'll probably have to provide the data and the facts to show something completely different. So, honestly...
Right, I'm not necessarily sure how productive it will be to go down that particular rabbit hole, because one can argue the demographics and turnout and designations and numbers.